Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Lentini, and I'm the host of Different Thinking for Different Times. And today, my guest is Ken Cole, and he'll tell you a little bit about himself. But he and I have had some fascinating conversations that resonate with me and maybe with you. That's up to you to decide, because I know a lot of you don't resonate with some of the stuff that I say, and that's okay, right? But what I'm doing is challenging people on this podcast to take small-minded thinking, what I call the acorn brain, and to challenge their own thinking and expand it to model what we live in. We live in something amazing. I mean, I call it a miracle. Humans call it a universe and an infinite because we that gives it some definition. But when you look at the James Webb telescopes and the Hubble and all the images we're getting back, including discovering things in space still to this day that confound and amaze physicists and the astrophysicists. And so will you amaze yourself by expanding your thinking? And there's so many places today that we can do that. We're being invited. That's what life is doing. The gift in life is in our experiences and through the people we meet, especially those situations and people that bother us, we're getting the invitation to expand. And perhaps we reject some of these people and situations because they mirror places in us that we don't see that we even have some of what we might accuse others of. And so with that, here's Ken Cole. Ken, welcome.
Thank you very much, Steve. Good to be here.
Great to have you. We've had some fascinating conversations. And before we get into that, start with your background and tell listeners about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So, and I want to touch on, why I find those conversations so fascinating as well. So,
Yeah.
my name is Ken Cole, and I met Steve through the workplace, and I am by training and by education, in the majority of my career, a mechanical engineer. So, a very calculated thinker, A-type personality, not by choice. I think that chooses us, right? But so I've been in business now for I don't want to date myself, but a long time, and have found. And I think this is getting to the part of why I think our conversations have been engaging to me, interesting to me, is I was always the kind of person, and I didn't realize it, that thought I could control things around me, situations, and I'm a believer. I'm a follower of Christ. I believe in God, and even with that belief, still thinking that I had control over certain aspects of things. And maybe it's the older you get, the more experiences you have, you realize that that's really not the case. And I think whenever you start to realize that and start to conduct yourself with that way of thinking, it's freeing, and not in the aspect of I don't care, but that you start to focus your energy on things that you do have some influence over. And that's why I find the conversations we've had very, very interesting, because I think we're a little bit like-minded in that respect, and you start to look at things a little bit introspectively, right? And what you can change in yourself to be a better person, a better leader, right? It makes life a little bit easier, at least in an A type's mind, anyway.
Yeah. I'm a reformed A type, and it's still in me, right? It doesn't go away, like you said.
No.
And it's something you just said that I wanted to pick up on, in that when you think about changing a life, right? You mentioned letting go of control, right? That was very similar. That's where we resonate. And when I realized that I did have power every time I changed myself, something new occurred. There was a different energy, and before I started that work, I wasn't willing to change myself, right? I was believing that little voice in my head that it was right. And I didn't realize it was only right. It sounded good because I had programmed it over the years. So, talk a little bit about that, how you recognized that point where you started to discover as you changed, things changed.
Well, that's funny. And as you were talking about that, I started to think about that point in my life, and that point was many, many, many years ago, and it's a journey, and it's kind of when you get in the vehicle, right? Your trip, and I don't believe there's an end to that trip, but you haven't gone any miles. When you pull the door shut, you haven't driven any miles yet. So when I first pulled the door shut, I had some tragedy in my life whenever I was very young. I was 20 years old. Um, Lost my dad unexpectedly. He was a young man. He was 52 at the time. I was
Wow.
20, and
Wow.
so when that happened, and so first of all, I'm going to back up about 4 or 5 years to that. So as a
Sure.
teenager, I worried about that because there was some family history and some health issues that had worried about, and so I used to fret about it a little bit, thinking that could control it, right? If I
Yeah.
worried about it, then it doesn't happen, which is
Yeah.
the furthest thing from the truth. All that worry does is change you and your life. So,
Yeah.
it kind of started then, and I didn't realize, as a kid, you're not going to realize that how you are about those certain aspects. So at 20, when I lost my dad, I had made a decision that it wasn't what I wanted for my life. It wasn't what it had wanted, and but that didn't change anything. My reality was still the same, regardless of
Yeah.
whether I wanted it or not. And then I realized I had no control over that reality.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning. So that's whenever to use the analogy, that's when I got in the car and pulled the door shut, but I hadn't driven any miles yet. So, so that's when I had the epiphany that, we don't have full control over our lives. And so many years later, I've realized that circle of control has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, right? That, I think you touched on it. When you finally realize that, um, and it comes with the A type, right? Where you want to argue with somebody because you think you're going to change their mind. Okay, which I can assuredly tell you, never in my life, through any argument, have I ever changed anybody's mind. You know, and that's a hard realization to come to for guys like us, right?
It is.
So so the further I've gone in my life, and it is again, I use the word freeing. The further I've gone in my life, to understand that, okay, I respect you as a person. Um, I don't agree with, I may not agree with what your thoughts are, what your beliefs are, but I respect you as a person. And part of that respect is, well, I'll share with you what I believe or what I think. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And, and then maybe, it's by example, you know, maybe somebody looks at you and says, "Boy, I see something different in that guy that I would like to emulate that." You know,
Yeah.
and that's a
Yeah.
hard thing because I think if somebody's being honest with themselves, um, there's things we look in the mirror. There's things we see that we don't like.
Yeah.
And sometimes you try to hide that from people. We don't. Nobody wants to be viewed in a negative way.
Yeah.
So I think whenever you start to really take control of that what you can control, right? Your inner being, what you are inside, how you treat other people, um, how you interact with other people. That's where the power is, right? If you really want to
Yeah.
change somebody else, let them see how you've changed yourself.
Yeah, especially as a leader of other people, and though in general, a leader of a family, whether a mother or a father, is to model behavior that you want to see in others. And the impact can begin in the home and then in the community, is to model it. And sometimes we see very small minded people. I mean, look at sports fields today.
Yeah.
Parents are fighting over a referee's call or a coach's call or that's very small-minded thinking, and yet it continues. We don't seem to learn our lesson as human beings. And again,
It,
see, now they're none of my business, right? I've got to stay out of that, and I use it as a reminder. Okay, so what can I do? And that it reminds me and encourages me to model the behavior I want to see. And we actually see less of that today because we have leaders in our current political environment. We're not going to get into one side or the other, but it doesn't matter because what they do is get up and just point fingers at either side, never taking an accountability. But then they're asking, by modeling that behavior, they're disturbed that the general populace is acting the same way. It's funny to me. I get a laugh at it, right? Here they are expecting all of us to be different when they're not civil or they're not reasonable or holding each other accountable and themselves accountable. So,
that's right. Do as I say, not as I do, right?
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
so you said a couple of things there that I want to touch on, and
yeah.
so as a leader in business, it can be frustrating, right? Whenever you have individuals who you want to, to be one way and they're a different way, but
Yeah.
more frustrating is this most important job of parenthood, and when you have a child and it's now for myself is now becoming a young man, and he's in his teenage years, and you spend all these years molding and shaping and trying to lead by example, and you see something that's outside of what your ideal is, and to
Hmm.
accept them for, well, that's they're their own person. And that was a hard thing for me, especially as an A-type person. And, this is my son. I have in my mind things should be a certain way, and when they're not
Right.
exactly to that plan, it's very hard to let go. But I think I'm getting better at recognizing that, well, he's his own person, and
Yeah.
let's understand from his perspective. And
Yeah.
you talked about the infighting, and don't get me going on youth athletics. I think I participated in athletics through my my entire life, and now with a son that's in a, in a few different activities, it is so frustrating to me because the
Yeah.
parents selfishly think it's about them, okay, which
Yeah.
it has nothing to do with them, but they all
Yeah.
have this ideal. It's all, in my mind, it's all based around this ideal parents have for their child. He's going to be the best. She's going to be the best. They're an all-star.
Yeah.
And whenever that's not the reality of what's happening, they want to control the situation, which they have no control over, right? By whatever means they need to
Yeah.
get that
Yeah.
vision and that reality that they want.
Well, and there's so many things in society that um, it seems impossible to change. But you talked about something, getting in your car of self-awareness, right? Self-growth, getting and closing the door and starting the journey. And that's something that resonates because I even mention this to clients, but I mention in all the podcasts is that it's a journey, not a destination, right? For humans to be in that space of not believing this little small-minded thinker that we've trained, right? Neurophysicists, neuroscientists, neuro researchers are actually now proving that up to the age of 35, our emotional responses and our reactions are remembered by the subconscious, and then it just says, oh, we know how you react to this person. You give them a piece of your mind, or we know what you do when you're in a long line in the supermarket. You give, you're pushing people, right? Hey, get moving. Why are you so slow? It's previously trained. But you mentioned that it's a journey. I'm fascinated by that. You got in the car in
Yeah.
your mind, right? And you closed the door and things changed. What changed for you? Or, when did that journey begin?
Well, so the journey, I think, like I said, I think the journey started, whenever I had some real tragedy in my life, very early on. That's when the journey started. But, the car wasn't real fast. It didn't go real fast. So there were little small incremental changes, right?
Yeah.
I to realize that I was in a, I didn't want to lose a parent at that age. I was halfway through college. It was a very,
Yeah.
very formidable time in my life. And I still needed, a lot of people, I said, well, 20 years old, you're a man. Yeah, not really. You
No.
still was relying on my family, my home. And so everything I'd ever known um, was gone in that respect. So, understanding that I didn't have any control. See, there I said it again. I didn't have any control over those situations.
Yeah.
Um, so I started the car moving forward. And then, I'd find myself, as an A type, I would argue with somebody about, well, here's what I think, and why would you think differently? And every time I would, leave that argument or leave that, wherever I was, whether it was with buddies, for a guy's weekend going away, and I'm driving home and I'm miserable and I'm angry and I'm thinking, why am I getting angry? Why they don't, you know,
Hmm.
and and I would see people, actually folks I worked with that were, I wouldn't say the nicest people, say things like, what do you care that that guy cut you off in traffic? You're never going to see him again. He's out of your life in 10 seconds unless you allow him to stay in there longer. And I'm thinking, if somebody like that can think about it in that way, why can't I? Because that the acorn, right? And that's
Yeah.
why. And
Yeah.
hey, there's still some of that garbage, you know, in all of us.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But I'd like to think the pile's a lot smaller now. So I like
Yeah.
again, I think the car moves a little quicker these days, but it's just weeding out, the garbage. Um, I sat in a kind of, to expound upon that a little bit further. I
Sure.
sat I sat in a I sat in a sermon one time, and they were
Hmm.
talking about forgiveness, right? And I never
Hmm.
thought about it this way. As simple as it seems, I never thought about it this way. That we're commanded to forgive, not for the person you're forgiving, but for you, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't have forgiveness, there's anger, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, you get angry. Somebody cuts you off. You're angry. They don't even know you're back there behind them in the mad. You're mad. They're not. They're going about their day. Ignorance is bliss, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so to allow those things that you can't control to control you make zero sense. Zero sense.
Yeah.
And uh,
Yeah.
and that's all it does. Those things that you can't control, the only thing that happens is it controls you. You
Yeah.
know.
That's
So
true. You're giving them rent-free space in your head,
that's it. And I think that
right?
the older I get, the longer down this journey I go, right, you start to recognize those situations more and more.
Yeah.
So, that journey started for me, I'm going to say, in 1989, right? And so,
Mhm.
you know, 35 years later, I'm still driving the car. It's a little, like I said, it's a little faster these days. I don't make as many wrong
Yeah.
turns, I would like to think. You know, the GPS works a
Yeah.
little better, to use that
Yeah.
analogy. But
Yeah. I love it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But, that doesn't mean there's not days. And there be, I think the difference now is there are days where, maybe I'm angry about, this person at work, or this person I have to deal with on whatever it is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're angry. We all get angry. To think that you're not
Yeah.
going to get angry or get angry at somebody else is absurd.
Yeah.
But at least now I can compartmentalize it. I recognize it as, hey, you know what? It's not going to change. It doesn't change anything. It only changes me. So let's just move on. That is what it is. And
Yeah.
and the reality is life has always been that way. Just how long does it take you to recognize that?
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of what we talk about here is that the infinite thinking looks at life as a gift and as a friend, and that the feedback we're getting is actually there to educate us, right? So that we can learn and grow. And we're not supposed to live a life that's without mistakes or failures or falling down, right? We're supposed to, because you mentioned the GPS. How did your GPS get updated? Because you said your GPS, you got a little better guidance today, right? So
That's
how
right.
did that happen?
That's right. Well, yeah, I mean, it's, well, so one of my favorite sayings I've ever heard, and I can't take credit for it, is um, good judgment comes from experience, and experience
Yeah,
comes from bad judgment. And
yeah,
that's life, right? And it's life,
yeah,
and it's that little voice that is I believe the creator, right, in all of us.
yeah,
There's been, anybody that's listening to this, and yourself, Steve, as you're going down the road of life and you're going to make a decision that's pretty impactful, there's always that little voice that most times, if you're in tune, right, it's all times, if you're in tune, is going to tell you to make the correct turn. And whenever
yeah,
you've made the opposite turn, boy, things get a lot harder, don't they?
yeah,
And I think the
yeah,
older you can, I think that comes with age, and what that age is. Hey, some people might have that at 20 years of age. I didn't. Okay. But to
yeah,
be in tune with, you know, let's, let's really seek out what and we all have that, I believe, that internal, innate, God given survival instinct that says, this is the right choice for you.
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
the
Well,
update to the
and
GPS, right?
I love it. I love the analogy, right? We get updated, and we get updated because we make mistakes and we look back and we might chuckle and say, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but now it's in the GPS and we go, oh no, I see this. I'm not going down that road again. And
That's
that's
right.
that's the purpose of life. That's really how to enjoy life and get to the place where we can love ourselves, including loving the messes and the failures and the fallings, because we're here to do that. We're here to do that.
Well, and think about this. What a blessing it is to be able to learn from those mistakes, because some
Yeah.
people, sometimes the judgment is harsh, right? And they don't get
Yeah.
an opportunity, to have this life to continue to learn. And,
Yeah.
there's, people are very quick, especially as you get older, right? You're very quick to judge. If a younger person makes a mistake, and well, they should have known better. Well, how? No, think about that for a
Yeah.
second, okay? The
Yeah.
only reason that
Right.
you know better is because you made that mistake. That
Right.
poor
Right.
person. Now they're learning the lesson. Another one of my
Right.
favorite sayings is, education is costly. Whether you pay for it out of your pocket or with experience, or education always costs something. And
Yeah.
so when folks are quick to judge that person should have known better, well, let's give them a little break here, okay?
If they knew better, they wouldn't have been born here, probably. This is the life school, right? They'd be
That's
born in, I
right.
don't know, another galaxy or another universe. I don't know, right? I don't know the answers to all that. And I did get to see a glimpse of something that was amazing. It was mind blowing, right? And people that have listened to this podcast know of the experience I had on November 18th, 5 days after being admitted to intensive care on November 13th, 2002. It goes back 21 and a half years. But I call it life waking me up with a 2x4, right? I was not doing what was mine to do in life and yet felt like I couldn't make the change. And I've even had, going back 20, 21 and a half years and more before that experience, I would have the daydream and even the nightmare of, or the dream of being on a train going this way, seeing a train coming this way with me on it. So life was telling me 5 or 6 years before the near death experience that I was on the wrong track,
Mm.
and it was about not honoring what was mine to do. Right? So it quickly got me on there. I gave up the license for a national sales training program after the near death experience, and started something called my own work, right? But that little voice was telling me, who the hell wants to listen to you, right? Your own work. You got a national license for this big prestigious sales training program. And but it wasn't about the sales training program. It was about, I was living from the outside in, right? I needed the validation of having that to say to people, well, I'm a XYZ sales licensee, right? Sales trainer. I didn't need it, as it turned out. And life
Yeah.
gave me the perspective of changing, and then having a broader passion for helping people go from small-minded thinking into infinite thinking. So it wasn't just sales training. That was the beginning so that I could eat and earn money. And now I combine all that into my sales and leadership training for people to be authentic and
Right.
and to be forgiving, right? As you talked about, and to look at life as a friend and a gift. What's it telling us, right? You mentioned a tragedy changed you. Very similar to me. I had a number of them. I had a brother commit suicide when I was 21. Just devastated the family. My father had a heart attack the next day. And then, of course, you flash forward to all these years later, having that near death experience. And life was, what I realized as I reflect back, was life was moving me gradually along all the time, right? It was never absent. The creator, God, was never absent. It was just me thinking that I was going to take over, that I had a better idea.
Well, and you think about that, as you're talking and you're thinking, you're talking using words like infinite and universe and this world that we live in, it's very finite, right? It's not infinite; it's very finite, and
This
I
world
think
is very finite, right?
yes, and I think a lot of times, folks, ourselves included, maybe we pursue the wrong things, right? There's a lot of material
Yeah,
things that to pursue.
yeah,
And when you think about that, it's the old adage, money doesn't buy happiness, and that really is. I mean, when you think about it, that is the honest truth. It
yeah,
truly doesn't. Now you can be miserable without it. I understand that. We all need, you
yeah,
know, we all
yeah,
need to live in this
yeah.
world. But for true happiness, when you start to pursue what makes Steve, what makes Ken happy inside, okay, has nothing to do with money, material things. It's a feeling. It's you know uh, your relationships you have with your loved ones. It's how you feel about yourself. It's a relationship you have with yourself, and most importantly, I believe it's a relationship you have with our Creator, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
which is infinity, right? It's
yeah,
and beyond, right?
and yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so and those things, Steve, I know we've talked about, I've had a supernatural experience myself,
yeah,
and which, only, and I don't even want to say it validates because I've never questioned, and a lot of times when people have tragedy in their life, I know people that have had significant tragedy in their life, and a lot of times it gives them uh, cause to question how can there be a God that would
right.
allow this kind of tragedy? And I
Yep.
can honestly say in my heart that I never thought that ever, not even didn't even cross my mind, because we have we don't have infinite knowledge. We have very, very finite. That acorn is really, and if we're lucky, it gets to be a walnut by the time we see the end of this world. So, when you think about it in that aspect of, we don't have the abilities to think infinitely. As much as we'd like to think we do not. And
Yeah,
the only thing we can do is try to expand our thinking
yeah,
more in line with that. And again, when you start to think, for me, when I start to think about it in that aspect, it makes things, tragedies. I don't know how a person could deal with a tragedy. I don't know how a person could deal with the loss of a loved one, thinking that this finite world, that's it, done.
true.
It'd be
That's
really,
true.
really difficult. You talk about allowing something to control you. That'd be terrible, terrible to have that feeling. So
Well, and some do. You're right. Some sink into it, right? Their journey becomes overwhelmed with the loss instead of looking at more to be revealed, right? That they're going to find out at the end of their own life, perhaps, what the whole reasoning was and what the intended lesson was.
right.
Uh, physicists might not say that because they'll say, well, you're only going back to the quantum field, right? Because energy doesn't get destroyed. Um, that wasn't my experience. I mean, I was in pure consciousness. And you mentioned the infinite. I felt like a drop of water in the ocean, a drop in the infinite.
Yeah.
And it was none of this thinking. That's what brought me to the acorn brain and realized I had to work on my thinking because this didn't go with me. This
Yeah.
that little voice, that incessant little voice that has us hanging on to past hurts and not forgiving people and learning certain automatic reactions, right? The automatic thought that leads to an automatic reaction. That's something I trained long, long time ago, and it takes work to overcome it. So
Well,
your point of having knowledge of something bigger, yeah, it is helpful, right? Even if we
yeah.
fall off the trail for a little bit, eventually we'll come back to seeing uh, miracles or the lesson or the gift.
Yeah, you hit on a couple of things. You said about, you trained that thought process, that reaction. I'm going to go one further. For generations and generations and generations,
It's
that
true.
training's been happening, right?
That's
And
true.
so,
Right.
so that's, I believe some of those behaviors are passed down, right? And so
Yeah.
it's hard.
Oh yeah.
So when you talk about making that journey, right? And we're all products of where we came from, okay, as
Yeah.
far as on this in this world. So it's hard to break that paradigm of thinking sometimes, which is,
Yeah.
hey, this is how it is. This is what's in my mind seems right, and it's
Yeah.
it's 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 not. Um, you know, my whole career has been spent in my education, in my career, spent in the science field. You'd mentioned quantum physics, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
always amazing. I've worked with some really, really intelligent folks, PhDs, physicists, um, those along that ilk.
Yeah.
And it's always amazing to me that a lot of those folks, science, right, because they can't touch it, they can't hold it, they can't derive it through an equation, that it must not exist. They
That's true.
deny the existence of God.
Yeah.
And, I remember I had asked a guy that I'd worked with, oh, this has now been probably 8, 10 years ago. He was a PhD, went to Carnegie Mellon University, very smart guy,
Mm-hmm.
um, but was a profound atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him one day, I said, "Well, okay, how do you propose we came to be here?" And he went through probably about a 20-minute dissertation that kind of just was, looping around in circles, and I listened patiently. And he ended it with a thermal accident. And I said, I'm sorry. I said, did you just say an accident? We're here by accident? And I said, boy, I said, you talk about faith. Now that's faith. Do you believe that we're here by an accident? You're making a lot of leaps. So it just it amazes me that and I believe, Steve, you talk about small-minded thinking. Our educational system, that they teach small-minded thinking, in my opinion,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They don't teach that expanse. If you can't touch it, if you can't hold it, if you can't derive it, then it's not so. That's
And
small minded.
it is, and in many institutions today, they're teaching people how to think. We have
Yeah,
professors and teachers, and I won't say aside, but we have professors and teachers that are coming from making one side wrong and the other side right, and vice versa, which is teaching people what to think, not how to think.
that's right. That's right. And us as believers, right? We I encourage people to think for themselves, right? Because if as a true believer, if someone's thinking for themselves, they can't help but think about what we're talking about, right? The
Yeah,
creation, infinity,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. And whatever conclusion they finally come to, they prove it to themselves. In the end, they own it when they make their life the experiment, right? We can each be scientists of our lives by putting out a different energy. You want to keep putting out small minded energy? Fine, right? See what that brings back. And then put out a larger minded and infinite energy, a limitless energy, which is definitely it's kinder, it's more forgiving. It doesn't mean you're without boundaries. It's there's a boundary, like you said, self-respect and respecting others is about expressing one's boundaries. What works, right? Here's what works for me, and I just want to talk about it. And then the other person can say, all right, well, here's what works for me. But that begins a negotiation,
Right.
which really is what relationships are about. But somehow we've lost this idea, especially in our leadership, and even to your point, in our education system.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, you look at the world we live in today, and instead of, and you said it, they're telling us how to think, okay, and it's based on division.
Yeah.
For somebody to somebody that thinks, leading people that are divided they think it's easy, right? I got to
Right.
divide in order to lead,
Right.
and so I'm going to tell you, Steve, how to think, so I can push you to one side of the fence, and I'm going to tell you, Ken, how to think, so you can go to the other side of the fence. And it's created a society, and I'm talking worldwide, where we have little respect for others,
True.
um,
True.
and it becomes, as and to go to a very simplistic uh, portion of it, even as a leader in the workplace, right, to manage other folks makes it very, very difficult, right? Because um, a lot of leaders don't, you don't have respect. That respect is gone. So how can you lead a group of anybody without that respect?
Yeah. Well, that can be a
It's
boundary.
it's the whole thing of, just because how's that go? Uh, because you don't agree with me makes me right and makes you wrong.
Right.
And that's
Right.
everything has come down to that.
Right. Right. The reason that we've come this way is not new, because Cicero said in the year, I don't know, somewhere around, I can find it. It's in my book Sage Advice, but I think it was 150 BC, something like that. Anyway, he said politicians aren't born; they're excreted.
A lot of
So we
truth to
haven't
that.
learned anything in 2,000 years. We're still electing
No.
people because people mostly are indifferent about leadership, right? We're not holding our leaders to a certain standard.
Well, yeah, and I think people just, and it amazes me. People, they don't want to get engaged or take an interest. And the people are fine with, I'll let somebody else handle that.
Yeah.
I don't have time to think about, I don't have time to worry about that. You know, we make a lot of decisions based on one emotion, and one emotion only, and it's fear. When you
Yeah.
think about it, and I'm gonna say, financially, people make a lot of financial decisions based on fear. And instead
Yeah.
of looking at the facts and say, well, this makes sense, and I use finances because there's hard numbers attached to it, right? That's where you can derive data and say, okay, well, this would make the most sense. And you can
Right.
put that out in front of somebody, but they're going to say, I don't, either they don't want to learn about it. I'm not interested. I'm going to leave. I'm safe here. I'm leaving everything here.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to do. And I
Yeah.
think politics and I think life is the same way. People get in their comfort zone. Don't want to get out of my comfort zone. I don't have time. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to think about it. You just tell me what to do. And
Yeah.
here we are. And politicians are more than happy to, acquiesce to that
Well,
arrangement.
in this country, I think we need a third party, maybe even a fourth party, because we've come to some idea that it's one or the other, and it's like we want a one party system and not have any challenges. It's that's a
Well,
reflection of human consciousness being very small minded, right?
well, and think about this. you go back. So these two parties. Okay,
Yeah.
you go back just 50 years. Okay, and you look at those two parties 50 years ago, and they look completely different than they look
True.
today. Okay, so
True.
it's not an ideal
True.
that's changed, right?
Yeah.
It's not a religion that's changed, right?
Yeah.
It's along the way, man has made things suit what is best for
Yeah.
them, all right?
Yeah.
So, and here
Yeah.
we are,
Yeah,
you know.
and it's a reflection of where we have a lot of work to do, but individually, that's where it starts, right? This is what we're talking about: is that each person has to embrace some expansion of their self awareness, right? That it's necessary. I've been reading a book more than once and listened to it a couple times. Self Observation by Red Hawk. Fascinating, right? He was studying what triggered him. And I don't know, I forget now how he came to the conclusion. I have the book here, and I listened to it. I've probably listened to it 3 times. This is what the book looks like: Self Observation by Red Hawk. And of course, I mark it, and
Yeah.
because I also teach from it in some groups I have. But he's not the only one. I mean, Sri Kumar Rao wrote "Are You Ready to Succeed?" I don't know, 20 something years ago. And he talked about developing a level of thinking above one's thinking. Dr. Roland Alexander wrote Wise Mind, Open Mind. Maybe that was 10, 12 years ago. Again, he talks about developing a level of thinking above our thinking. And then Red Hawk talks about self observation. Learning what triggers us is the base root of developing a level of thinking of one's thinking. Because once we recognize what triggers us, we still have work to do. Because now we got to make some new choices if we
Yeah,
want, right? If we want.
that's right. Well, you think about this, Steve. You know, the time that you and I have been on this earth, even
Yeah.
even collectively, is very, very small. Very
Oh my
small.
God.
All right. So
Yeah.
then you look back, even just in recent history. Okay. Let's look at
Yeah.
let's look at 100 years back and forward,
Yeah.
and how society has changed. All right. And so what changed it? You know, unconsciously, I believe, people started thinking differently about things. Okay. Maybe not in a good way. Okay. What's important? It's important to have 3 cars in the garage and take 4 vacations a year. And we'll put the kids in daycare, which I call the early prison system. Right. I mean, but I'm being facetious, but society, because people pursue, right, instead of thinking at a higher level. Well, I see the neighbors are doing this. That's what we should be doing. And
And
so,
yeah, part of that is human nature. But what would you say to people, or even teenagers or educators? What would you say to them today about what you would impart on them, right? What from what you've learned?
uh, that's a good question. And um, so that's a little bit of a conundrum, right? Because it's different than what we just talked about, right? So I'll tell you what I believe, right? So it's
Yeah. Yeah.
so
You're not going to change them, but
right,
maybe
right, right.
one person might consider a thought,
Yeah.
right?
Here's what I think. I think, and we're all guilty of it. I think fundamentally we have started to pursue the wrong things in life. What makes, if you ask 10 people, what is the measure of a successful person, you're going to get 10 different answers.
Yeah.
So I think, my idea of success, my idea of success is different than it was 30 years ago. Um, But I think fundamentally, as a society, I think humanity, has started to pursue the wrong things. I think we're very wrapped up in material pursuits. Hey, things are
Yeah.
nice. Things are nice. Don't get me wrong. I
Yeah.
like things. I like to have a new car. I'd like to go on a vacation. Things are nice. They're great. But what do any of those things matter I mean, we're all one MRI away from your life changing on a dime. And then what's going to matter? Are those things going to matter so much? I don't think they would. Okay.
No.
Did those things matter to you, Steve, whenever you were laying in a hospital bed 21 and a half years ago, right? And you left this world. Okay. Did any of those things matter? None of them
No.
matter. And
No.
for me, I think if society would get back, and again, I'll tell you what keeps leave it to Beaver keeps coming to mind, right? I mean, so but what I mean by that is that the family, okay,
Hmm.
that helping these small human beings known as our children, right? That
Hmm.
helping them to develop into and look, I like sports. Spending your weekend at an ice rink or on a baseball field, okay, in my opinion, it's great. But if that's your focus on what gives your child value, or in my opinion, it's not. Okay, and I think we've lost focus on what real value, right? What's real value in our lives, and hitting 3 home runs, it's great, but that's not what real value is, right?
No. No.
And it's I think that's where things need to go back to. My wife and I, we made some tough decisions, and we just have one child, and but we
Hmm.
made some tough decisions a long time ago. But we
Hmm.
for us, we thought it was the best thing, and I understand. Everybody has different situations,
Right.
but I think fundamentally we pursue a lot of material things in this world that have no
Yeah.
value.
Yeah.
You know, no real value.
Yeah. I mean, there's reports on whether consumer spending was up or down, and then the stock market scares the hell out of people if consumer spending is down. And really, we'll all figure out a way to survive no matter what happens. I mean, people did survive the Great Depression. It was not easy, but
Well,
people figured out a way to live through it. My parents lived through it. My mother was born in 1909. My father was born in 1904. So they were in their 20s. And all of a sudden, there was no work. I mean, he was working on the CCC, the Conservation Corps, and he worked on the WPA. He worked on
right.
government projects. But we figured out a way, is my point, that we don't trust. Just like with climate change, we don't trust that we do live in something bigger. The climate has changed over the eons, every so many 25,000 years or so. I'm not saying we don't have a responsibility to live and do the right thing, but when people start saying we've got 12 years left, by the way, I think that was 4 years ago, that means we got 8 years left. That's ridiculous, right? Is to gradually think about it, and you'll enroll more people, but we want people to change overnight on anything. I didn't mean to get off on the track of climate
No,
change. My point was trying to scare people
there you go.
is
You said it
is
right there.
is small minded.
So scare, right? That what emotion does that invoke?
Fear,
Fear, right? And we
right?
talked about that. You
Yeah,
can't you can't think bigger with fear. Fear
that's
is
true.
the anti big thinking inhibitor, right? You
Yeah,
can't fear cripples us all. It keeps us all in our place. Okay, the stock market,
yeah,
financially, you hit on everything I talked about earlier, right? The stock
yeah,
market, it's scary, right? It is. It can be fear.
yeah,
I'm going to
yeah,
lose all these material things. Okay, okay,
yeah,
well, yeah, maybe you will. Okay, but being afraid doesn't change anything. It inhibits you from thinking bigger. Okay, um,
yeah,
you know, uh, it's kind of that deal. We've all seen the movie where somebody's being chased down by the bad guy, right? And they get into an office building at night and it's dark, and they hide and they don't move because they're scared, right? And they eventually
yeah,
get found, right? Instead of
yeah,
being proactive to get out of the situation, fear
yeah,
keeps us in that situation, and it
yeah,
doesn't. And you stay in the same. You stay still, and nothing's going to change. So, I
yeah,
hear a lot of people say, they weren't, they're not happy with this, that, the other of their lives. But what have they done to change it? They've done nothing.
yeah.
and they
Yeah.
expect it's going. And I have a hard time feeling compassion for those folks because
Yeah.
there was a lot of things that I've done through my life, as I'm sure you have in my career, that I didn't want to do. I mean, it wasn't
Yeah.
enjoyable. Driving a couple hours each way to work, or flying across the country for an overnight trip, and then 48 hours. It's just, but not enjoyable. But you do it because you don't want to. You want to improve your situation.
Yeah. You're
And
taking care of your family, or yeah.
sure. And if we're
Yeah.
afraid, if we're afraid to do any of those things, you never move. You stand in place.
If you're
And
afraid of losing your job, you're not going to bring your best self to the job. You won't speak up, right?
yeah, that's a great point. And all the years I've worked, I have yet to see anybody get chastised for legitimately trying something. And it maybe doesn't work out all the time, but and I can honestly say, in my entire career, I've never seen anybody get in trouble for trying.
Yeah. Well, it's a culture, right? Small-minded thinking would be people not trying things, fear of failure, and a larger-minded thinking and culture would be let's try it, right? As long as the company won't go bankrupt, let's try it.
You can even take that back. When we talk about people pursuing material things, right? And a lot of times in our society, right, you base people's success on their material standing, in the world, how much money they have, how big their house is, what kind of all that stuff. All right.
Yeah.
So you talk about fear. How many people do you know that? And I could sit here and I could name a lot. I personally know who threw fear aside and said, "I'm going to try this." Okay. And ignorance is bliss kind of thing. If it works, great. If not, I'll try something else, that are ultra successful. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
very few people stand on the shore and calculate, well, geez, and I'm not saying you just rush into something, blindly, but generally it's always fear that holds people back
Yeah. No
and
risk,
keeps
no
you from thinking
reward.
big. Right. Right. And you don't
Well, and
think big.
how many people that are very successful, nobody asks them the question, what was it like? What was the journey like? Because
Yeah.
often it was a failure, a success, two failures, three successes, et cetera, all the way down the line.
And what if they got so afraid after that first failure that they just stopped? They didn't move anymore. They stopped
Yeah.
the car.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, part of it's human nature, Ken, right? So part of it is human nature. What we've lost is the ability to have a dialogue with people and not get upset and angry and, like you said, try to change their mind. We default into the smallest minded thinking when we're reacting. To be okay with others having a disagreement and have a dialogue, right? Having a difference of opinion and have a dialogue about it, and maybe, okay, so we agree to disagree. That's what somehow we've lost.
Well, you're right. And I don't think in my life I've never had that kind of a conversation with somebody and they say right then and there, "You know what? You're right. I've changed my whole way of thinking." All I can hope for is you know, you plant a few seeds that maybe they go home that night and they're sitting there and they're thinking, "You know what? Ken said this, and maybe there is a little truth to that. Let me think about that."
Yeah,
And that's all any of us could hope for, you
yeah.
know. And as far as
That's
changing,
exactly what I'm hoping to do with the podcast. Is over time. It's been 5 years now, and is to every time is just with all the guests and the places where I've left a thought and the guests have left a thought, is to have them consider places where they are small minded and how a change into something more limitless and infinite, which matches what we live in, might change their circumstance and it maybe impact others. And that's the whole consideration, is that if we leave a seed somewhere. I love I love your analogy of getting in the car on a journey. Maybe they get in their car on the journey of self-awareness today and think about, all right, what can I change? what mistakes have changed my GPS, right? Where I know automatically I'll make a new decision
Mm-hmm.
and maybe be grateful and forgiving of themselves for past mistakes, right? That the GPS was out of control.
Right.
I love that analogy. And just ponder the places that they could think bigger because it's broad. It could be education, it can be the workplace, it can be politics, it can be in their
Sure.
family. These are all the things that we've covered. Could be their
You know,
faith.
yeah, that's right. And I know you don't know this, Steve, and it's one of the conversations we had throughout a couple of our work meetings here. But you said something that made me stop and think about a few things. And recently, had the opportunity that I changed my thoughts on. And you had told me that, and I'm this guy, right? You're driving along and you see somebody that's standing there with a sign that says, unemployed, need rent money. And I used to think, if you can stand there holding a sign, you can go get a job. There's a for help sign across the street. Go get a job. I'm not going to fund your habits or whatever in my mind. I think the reason being. But you
Mm-hmm.
said, well, I look at it a little bit differently. Maybe God crossed my path with that person for the day, and that's what I'm supposed to do. And who are we not to do what's commanded of us, right? Um,
I never used to think that way. I thought occasionally I would do that in prior years, but
right,
if friends were with me and they'd say, "You're not going to give that guy money," I'd put my hand back in my pocket. And then I realized through that experience, right, 21 and a half years ago of being on the other side, well, maybe it's my test. It's not their test.
right.
It's
That's
my
right.
test. Will I be generous? Will I be limitless thinker, infinite thinker? Will I expand beyond that small-minded thought? And if we think about it, we all get those little tests
Oh,
to
yeah.
in they're invitations, I call them, to expand into something bigger.
Yep.
Maybe it's bigger as a human being, ourselves.
And you see, that was a GPS correction that came down from Steve to my GPS.
And you don't have to give them your life savings, by the way, to pass
No,
the test.
no. But and here's that's a good point. I don't think there's a measure on. I think the measure's in here. How do you feel about it in here? Did you
Yeah,
give him that $5 bill or $20, whatever it was? Did you give it with a
yeah,
giving heart and give it
yeah,
and feel good about giving it to him, and it's for you? Or there's the
yeah.
other side. There's the other side of that. The folks that do it and then call you up and say, "Hey, guess what? I gave somebody $20 today. On the street
Right,
corner." That's wrong
right,
too, because then now you're
right,
self-serving, right?
right,
And it's not about
right.
self-serving. It's about you doing what your GPS is telling you that's the right turn
Yeah.
to make.
Yeah, well, and age old. I mean, Christ said, "When you give, make sure your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing."
That's right. And
Yeah,
that's a
give it.
really good point. My wife and I have that conversation all the time. Um, one of the things. So and I'm not going to say that I'm not on any social media, right? Because I
Yeah,
am more as a bystander observer than a contributor.
yeah, yeah,
But folks that will do things for a charity, whether it be through the church or otherwise, and then post about it on Facebook, drives
yeah,
me insane. Then
yeah,
to me that says, well, you did it for the wrong reasons, right?
yeah,
Because you're right. Christ
yeah,
said the right hand should know what the left hand is doing, and
yeah,
that's why
yeah.
it's not for
And
us.
a lot of people get upset with certain faiths, but I'm going to say what Muhammad said many thousands of years ago, or hundreds of years ago. I think it's 1,000 years ago. But of course, he acknowledged Christ as a prophet, and Muslims do, or and fascinating that Jewish people and the Muslim and the Christians are all derived from Abraham. They have the same tree, so we have a lot more alike than we have disalike. And there's people throughout the generations that have taken a thought or a code or a mission to an extreme and lost their prophet's message. Because Christ said also everything works together for good. And Muhammad had a very similar message. He said it in a way that I get reminded of often when I want to react to something or be bothered by something during my day. He said, "What reaches you was never meant to miss you, and what misses you was never meant to reach you." And I can tell you that I spent a lot of my years on the opposite side of both of those quotes, meaning that I was angry about certain things that had reached me and then lamenting things that had yet to reach me, right? I wanted them from the outside in, right? And today, the combination of everything works together for good, and that quote that what reaches you was never meant to miss you, and what misses you was never meant to reach you, has me reminding myself to embrace whatever shows up, that okay, this must be the plan.
And and let me ask you, how much control do you have over those things that miss you or reach you?
None. I thought I did,
That's, that's right. That's right.
but that was
And,
the small-minded thinker, right? That was running out of control. It was you could change this, get active on it, right? And
yeah, yeah.
I was fighting life. And what brought me the most amazing changes was gratitude and surrender. I was grateful waiting for the ambulance. This feeling came over me. And as I reflect back on it, maybe 10 years later, I realized it was also the divine presence of something other, right? I didn't yet get a peak. It was 5 days later before I got that peak, but I was grateful. And then the surrender 5 days later, when I was asked the question, stay or go.
Mm,
I'm in the infinite. I have no little voice in my head. I only have consciousness. And it was doing most of the talking, right?
mm.
The life review. And then the question, stay or go. And I surrendered with thy will be done. It didn't matter, stay there or come back here. And I was back in intensive care with the two friends at the end of my bed who had just been shushed out 20 minutes earlier because my alarms were going off. And the doctors and nurses came running in saying, out, out, this is it, call his family. And I hadn't surrendered like that fully,
Right,
right? With
right.
let God do it. Let thy will be done.
Yeah,
And I can
yeah.
tell you, so it's gratitude and surrender that is actually limitless thinking. I didn't know that at the time, but as I think about it, because I get invited by that acorn brain every day to try to be not grateful about something or to fight something or to lament something, want
It's easy.
something more.
It's easy.
And it's just, yeah, when I let it go, it's amazing what happens. I mean, $24,000 came in the mail when people heard I was in the hospital, and 5 job offers. I didn't send one resume. I didn't make
Wow.
one phone call, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I used this analogy previously. We talked about, creation and the wonderment of it all, right? I mean, I'm an outdoorsman, right? I spend a lot of time outside and
Yeah.
in nature. And when you look at, this time of year, with all the flowers blooming, and you look at the colors on those flowers or the birds. I saw a Baltimore Oriole yesterday. You look at that
Yeah.
bird and you
Yeah.
think, okay, so those who don't believe, you're saying we all came from the same thermal accident. All right, that bird with those bright orange feathers and this flower that's blue and me, all from the same thing. Okay,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
I mean that to me as a thinker, period, big or small, makes zero
Yeah.
sense. And to believe that, the analogy that I used is, if you really believe that, then you believe you could stand outside of a junkyard. All right, we talked about this, and a tornado could whip through that junkyard, an auto junkyard, and build you a perfectly brand new working vehicle on the other side. And I mean, and people say, well, no, I don't, that's ridiculous. Well, that's what you believe if you
That's
believe
true.
all of,
That's what a thermal
right.
accident would be.
That's
Right.
right. That's what would be an accident. And if
Right.
it happens enough times and the parts hit together, in an infinite number of ways, right? It's eventually going to happen. And anybody, I would think anybody would say, well, yeah, that's not realistic. That's not how it is. Well, I don't believe how you could think this world came to be that way then too.
By accident. Yeah.
Yeah, by
Well,
accident.
and the intricacies of so many different creatures that that some we can't see because they're so small. They all have a job. They all have a
Oh,
purpose, right? If something gets dies at the side of the road, nobody really has to go clean it up. Nature takes care of it. There are so many things that have a job to do, and
absolutely.
yet on a bigger level, we don't look for our own purpose. That's the argument. Small-minded thinking takes a job and is miserable in it for a whole life instead of looking at where life is pointing them to express what they came here to do. There's a passion somewhere.
Well, yeah, and, and when we talk about, you mentioned, religion earlier. When you talk about, people say, "Oh, you're religious." Religion is, to me, it's a bad word. You can be religious about anything. You can be religious about getting up and having your coffee in the morning a certain way. That's what the
Mm-hmm.
definition
True.
of religion is.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, people have been fighting over religion for thousands of years. Okay,
Yeah.
but it's all man driven. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and if you truly believe, I believe in Jesus Christ. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
with that belief, okay, if whomever, if I want to share that with you, I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray for you. Okay. And if I truly have faith in my belief, then God's going to change your heart. Okay. And so for
Mm-hmm.
anybody, for our world and our society to be doing this all the time over that small-minded thinking, right? Because some man has told them they need to think about it this way. And if this guy doesn't think about it the same way you think about it, then let's do this. It's
Right.
insanity. It's insanity.
It's insanity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's very small-minded. And whatever created this to such intricate detail, all the different creatures, I don't think is small-minded. That's just a question I ask, right? Is it small? Does it sound like small-minded thinking? Because the
No.
creator, whatever created this, right? Even if people don't want to call it God, I don't have any qualm about that, right? You let each person choose their own journey. If you say it's nothing created all this. To your point about it's a thermal
Accident.
explosion, a
Yeah.
thermal accident.
Well, you said it too. If somebody doesn't believe, I I don't agree with them, but I can't change them.
No,
I've never changed anybody.
no,
I've never changed anybody, and nor
no,
have you or anybody else in this world. You've
no,
never changed a soul. You've never changed a mind. You've never changed a heart. You
no.
maybe have planted some seeds that, with their expanded thinking, may have come to that realization eventually.
Maybe,
Yeah,
maybe.
maybe.
I'm not tied to it. I'm
Well,
just doing
no.
what's mine to do, right? I'm like a microscopic. I'm like an amoeba. I'm splitting one into half and doing what's mine to do.
Well, could you imagine being tied to it? How frustrating that would be. How could you live your
Oh,
so you talk about small and I came from that, right? I came from that small-minded thinking, all right? So we're talking
yeah,
about really big things, right? We're talking about infinity. But now let's bring it down to our day to day and you know, you think you can control, you know, Joe that you called this morning
no,
and told to run, his TPS report and he didn't do it,
right, right,
you can't.
right.
And to
No,
allow that to control you, it's a vicious, torturous cycle.
yeah. Well, those are things you have to manage as part of the job,
That's right.
and that is a skill you have, right? Is to manage it, and those are the things we can control. And what we're talking about is to encourage people to question their own thinking, like you did. You
Right.
started on the journey, right? You got in the car, and it began slower and proceeded
You
faster,
got to put
right?
you got to put the car in gear, right? You can't
Oh,
just
you
get
got to
in
put
it.
the
You
car
got to
together,
put it in
right?
gear to make it go.
Right. Right.
Um,
Just don't get
but
in there, close the door, and sit and park.
hey, and to use that same analogy and to come back in full circle, you can't be afraid to step on the gas, right? Because
Right. Right.
people, us as human beings, we don't like change.
No.
Nobody likes change, and especially in yourself. You're thinking, well, geez,
Yeah.
I'm not really happy how things are now, but boy, I could be less happy if I do it, if I try to change that. And that's
Right.
small thinking, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Staying
so,
comfortable is a misnomer because
and,
typically something will occur that'll make us uncomfortable if we don't make it purposeful,
that's
stretching
right.
ourselves.
That's
Yeah.
right. And remaining in that comfort zone is driven out of fear, that one
Yeah.
emotion that keeps us all in our place.
Yeah. Well, what do you want to close with?
Well, I would say, I enjoy these conversations. It's nice to talk about these things because, a lot of times it's things you don't want to talk about with other people, right? I mean, because you think, well, they're going to think I'm a kook, but I think,
You're
when
not.
you
You're
really,
not.
yeah,
That's
well,
small minded.
that's small minded, right? So when
Right.
you really start to look introspectively at yourself and think about things on a much bigger scale, and it's hard to do, push fear out of your life. My wife and I have just recently done something for our lives, this little finite piece of what we are here on earth. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say it was scary. And I was afraid for a day or two. And then I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, that's silly. That's silly. Letting that small minded thinking come back in, right? Because fear is a very
Mm-hmm.
strong emotion. But when you start to
Mm-hmm.
put that fear aside and you start to be honest with yourself and with other individuals, right? It's freeing. Um, and,
Yeah.
to realize what we have control over is just in here. And, and sometimes this, not all the time, but
Yeah.
the more control you try to get over that, because it's the only thing really, our being is the only thing we can control in this world. That's it. You
Yeah.
can't control.
Yeah.
When you really stop and think about it, you can control nothing else. You can manage
Yeah.
things, but you can't control them. And
Yeah.
when you start to think about it, at least when I start to think about it in that respect, um, it definitely, I think it opens up doors for better things, not only
Yeah.
in this world but beyond.
Yeah.
That's what I'd say.
Yes. Well, thank you, Ken Cole. This
You're
is
welcome.
this is different thinking for different times, and what we've been kicking around is where we are all small-minded, including ourselves, and what we've done about it, and that it's a journey. I mean, Ken mentioned he gets in the car after his father passed, and that began his journey of self-observation and self-awareness, and that he had once he shut the door, he had to put the car in gear, and then as he's gotten a little older, he can travel a little faster on the journey of self-awareness. And that self-awareness is limitless thinking. It's the place when we start to question our own answers, because who will if you don't? And most people don't want anyone else to question their answers. So it's for each of us to begin to question our answers, all those places where we've decided this is how we'll be, and instead have a dialogue with others, maybe others that make us uncomfortable. And then, like Ken said, to question their own decisions in life. Where are you holding back because of fear and trying to stay comfortable? It's okay if that's a choice you make, and we're urging you to push off from shore, right? And get a little uncomfortable, because you may learn some amazing things about yourself and others. You may impact others in an amazing way. Maybe plant the seed with others so that they can advance and change and impact others. So that's our thought process here on Different Thinking for Different Times. It's season 5, episode 18. And we're grateful for Ken Cole, and grateful for all our listeners, which is now, I think, 25 countries and almost 3,000 listeners. And so I'm grateful for everybody's participation. And you can email me, by the way, if you want to question my own thinking. I'm always up for the challenge, and you can reach me at steve@stevelentini.com. That's steve@stevelentini.com. And remember, I might just ask you, does that sound like small-minded thinking? Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Ken. Grateful.
As am I.